Hello and welcome to Vvork. I'm Brian Watrous and this is the 46th video in a 10-part video series where we're learning how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. In this particular video, we're going to take a look at another simple technique that you use when working with Orchestrator workflows. Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at how to run a workflow. You can use the older legacy client, the Java-based client. You can use the new HTML5-based client. So both VRO clients can run workflows. Additionally, you can use other tools such as CloudClient.exe. Cloud Client is a command line interpreter-based way of running not just Orchestrator workflows, but working with the Orchestrator REST API in general. Plus, Cloud Client can also interact with vRealize Automation and Site Recovery Manager. So you could use Cloud Client to kick off Orchestrator workflows. You can kick off Orchestrator workflows from vRealize Automation. In fact, vRealize Automation has a number of different extensibility techniques that it allows VRA to kick off Orchestrator workflows in a variety of ways. You can run Orchestrator workflows by using the older legacy vSphere web client. That's the Flex-based web client. Currently, at least last I checked, the newer HTML5-based vSphere client does not yet support the ability to run Orchestrator workflows. The other way that you can run Orchestrator workflows, the last bullet item that we see here, is through Orchestrator's REST Server API. Orchestrator has a REST API that not only allows external clients to be able to run workflows and check the status of workflows and cancel workflows and respond to user interactions in workflows. Not only does the REST API in Orchestrator allow you to work with workflows, it does a ton more. But for our purposes in this video, we'll just simply point out that any sort of external client, whether that's a program that you write or it's a third-party product, anything that can act as a REST client can kick off Orchestrator workflows by going through Orchestrator's REST API. Let's take a look at the first two techniques though. So running workflows via the legacy Java-based VRO client, and then we'll look at the HTML5-based client. So here we are in the legacy Java-based VRO client, and as you can see, I'm editing my workflow. It's a terribly exciting workflow. It has a single schema element in it, a scriptable task that logs the message "Hello World." If I want to run that workflow, I can actually do so a number of different ways. While I'm in the editor, I can choose to run the workflow by simply clicking here. If that workflow had input parameters, a window would have popped up and I would have been able to answer the input parameter questions. This workflow is much simpler than that, so it doesn't do so. When you run a workflow within the editor, over on the right side of the page, you have three different tabs: the General tab, Variables tabs, and Logs tab. The General tab gives you general information about the workflow, including the name of the workflow, the ID of the workflow token. This is not to be confused with the workflow's ID. The workflow token could be used by a Orchestrator REST client to see what's going on with that workflow that I kicked off. In this case, though, the workflow is already completed, so I can't see it as it's running because it's already done, but I could see things like its completion status, did it succeed, did it fail, what were its outputs, and so forth. And additionally, we have other exciting information like when the Orchestrator workflow started and when it completed. The Variables tab will list all of the variables. In this particular workflow, there are no variables, but we would see the name of every variable, the type of every variable, the value of every variable, and again, that's every single input parameter, every single output parameter, and every single attribute. The only type of variable you cannot see in here is local variables that are defined within the schema elements themselves. But all the other variables, I can see what they are, I can see their type, I can see their value, and I can even, while the workflow is running, I can even change the values of those workflows variables. Plus, we also have down below an area where you'll see an exception message. If the workflow fails for whatever reason, we can find out the reason or find out what's going on by looking at the exception message. Here, this workflow succeeded, so we don't have an exception message. And we also have a Logs tab, which in this case shows the terribly exciting message, "Hello World." That's the message that my code said to log. Now, there's a slightly different way of running workflows, which involves clicking this button here labeled debug. That's used when you set breakpoints on your schema elements. If you set a breakpoint, which you can see I've done so by the presence of this blue circle, if you set breakpoints and run the workflow through the debugger, it will pause the workflow as it hits each schema element that has a breakpoint set on it. Incidentally, in another video series, I talk about debugging in both the VRO client, in the older legacy-based, Java-based client, and in the new HTML5-based client. So you might want to check out that video. But in the meantime, if you are setting breakpoints, remember, don't click the Run button, because the Run button does not pay attention to breakpoints. Only the debugger does. All right, so you've now seen two different ways of running a workflow from within the editor. On the other hand, if you were to leave the editor, I'm going to click Save and Close, go ahead and continue. If you're back on the main screen, you can run the workflow by selecting the workflow and clicking on the play button. That will run the workflow. But notice, if you right-click the workflow, you could do the same thing by choosing Start Workflow or typing Control-R. In the menu, you also have the choice to start the workflow, but have it run using another identity. So even though I'm logged in as Brian W., I could start this workflow and have it run as someone else. Start Last Workflow Run allows you to run the workflow again, except when the input parameter screen pops up, it will already be pre-populated with all the answers that we gave the last time we ran the workflow. Actually, a little caveat, it will have cached all the answers except for password type fields, specifically encrypted strings or secure strings. Additionally, in here, we can run the workflow through the debugger, similar to what we saw while we're in edit mode. You can schedule the workflow to run at some time in the future. You can schedule the workflow to run sometime in the future as somebody else, and so forth. Plus, one other way you can run workflows is to go to an existing token. So I just ran this workflow a few moments ago. Here's the token for that workflow. And if you right-click a workflow token, you also have the ability to run that token again, which is a shorthand way of saying run the orchestrator workflow, passing in the answers that we gave for the input parameters when we ran that workflow before. Similarly, we've also got run this token again as someone else. Profiling allows you to see what parts of the workflow are taking how much time. Debug, schedule, and schedule as. So that's lots of different ways just within the VRO client, the Java-based VRO client, that you can run orchestrated workflows. Let's go take a look now at the new HTML5 client. As you can see, I'm already logged in and looking at a workflow. If we look at this workflow, it's identical essentially to the one that I just showed you before. It's actually a separate workflow, but it does the same thing. If I want to run this workflow, I can do so by clicking the Run button. When I run the workflow, you can see it running. Plus, in the new HTML5 client, it automatically gives you information about how long each schema element is taking to run. So 18 milliseconds here, nice and fast. And once you've run that workflow, similar to the Java-based client, you have a General tab, a Variables tab, a Logs tab that do the same thing as the Java client. It's just positioned differently on the screen. It's down on the bottom instead of over on the right. Plus, you have a Performance tab, where, as you can see, it does a performance analysis of what it took to run that particular workflow. If you want to run the workflow again, you can click Run again. So here we are running the workflow again. Took a little longer this time for some reason. If I click Run again, and again, and again, I keep running the workflow again and again and again. And each time it's updating the General tab, Variables tab, Logs tab, Performance tab. Now, if I want to run the workflow using the new HTML5 VRO client's debugging capability, you click on Debug. So just like before, there's a Run button and a Debug button. You may notice that the Run button's disappeared. I'll show you how to get that back. But Debug works like the debug mode in the older Java-based client. But notice that when you do debugging in the newer HTML5 client, if you try to right-click on a schema element and choose new breakpoint, it doesn't let you do that because the granularity of where you set breakpoints is different in the HTML5 client. In the Java-based client, you set breakpoints on schema elements. And in the Java client, you cannot set a breakpoint on an individual line of code in the scriptable task. On the other hand, in the HTML5-based client, the new one, if you select something such as a scriptable task, go to the scripting tab. In this particular case, there's not that much code here. Let me add a little bit more code. Actually, I'm in read-only mode. Because I'm actually in read-only mode because I'm not in the editor mode for this workflow. So let's actually take the opportunity to show you how to get back into the editor mode, and additionally how to get back that run button that seems to have disappeared. To get back there, what I'm going to do is, well, there's no save or close button the way we usually see down here. Instead, the way I'm going to go get back to that workflow is either to go back to workflows and search for it, or you can simply click on the name of the workflow. And notice that's going to take us from activity workflow runs. When I click here, it's not going to be on activity workflow runs anymore. Instead, it takes us back to library workflows, and it actually puts us into the workflow. I've got the run button back and the debug button and so forth. But if I want to run this workflow, as I was attempting to demonstrate before, with a breakpoint set on it, you do not set the breakpoint on the schema elements. Rather, you select a schema element that has some JavaScript code, go to the scripting tab, and again, forgot my semicolon there. Let me make this workflow a little bit more exciting. So it says hello world several times into the log files. With the new HTML5 debugger, you can set breakpoints on each of these lines by simply hovering over to the left of the lines of code that you want breakpoints set on. Just click on them. If you don't want a breakpoint, you just click the red circle, it goes away. But when you run this workflow now through the debugger, not just run, but through debug, the workflow will stop's too strong a word, will pause as it hits each of those breakpoints. Now, I have another video series, and the second video in that series talks about the debugger and the HTML5 VRO client in more detail. So if you want to know more about debugging, go check out over there. And as you can see, in the HTML5 client, we can say run, we can say debug. That works in both cases similar to what you saw in the VRO client, the older Java-based client. But what about if we're out of this editor mode? What if we save and close, and we're back here in the workflow section? Well, again, in the workflow section, we're going to have to find that workflow. Here it is. Here, from the main screen, outside of the editor mode, you can run the workflow. But notice the only choice that you have here is run. In the HTML, in the current instantiation of the HTML5 editor, you can run a workflow, and other options such as scheduling the workflow and so forth are not accessible through here, but rather if you go to the actions drop down, or in this case drop up list, you can choose to schedule the workflow here. If you try to run the workflow using the pre-existing workflow tokens that got created as we ran the workflow, those don't show up when you're in the library workflows view. Instead, if you want to rerun a workflow token, you need to go to activity, workflow runs. Runs and tokens mean the same thing. You need to find your workflow, which you can find with a variety of techniques. I'm going to, again, search for the workflow by name. You can also search for the workflow by its token, by a specific workflow token, but that's more work than I'm looking to do here. I don't want to have to deal with one of those crazy looking hexadecimal workflow token IDs. I'll just search for it by name. And you can see here the different workflow tokens. If you want to see what happened when you ran the workflow previously, just select the appropriate token and you can see all the information that you saw before. Again, if I click here, it's not quite where I meant to go. Forgive me here. I meant to go back to workflow runs. If I search for the workflow, they happen to be showing up on the top here, so I don't have to search for them. The ... button here allows you to see the details like I just showed you, or delete it But notice there's no run option here. And furthermore, if you go to details, you can, in the details section, actually run the workflow again using the information that was cached into this workflow token. So you can do the same types of things, it just behaves differently. The one thing that I have not seen yet in the HTML5 client, perhaps this feature exists and I just haven't stumbled into it, but I do not yet see any way through the user interface in the HTML5 based VRO client, I don't see any way to run the workflow using somebody else's identity. So perhaps that's a feature that's here and I just don't see it, or perhaps that's a feature that's coming in a future version of the HTML5 client, but in VRO 7.6, running the workflow as somebody else apparently is a feature that's not yet exposed in this new client. So there we go. Again, this video series is talking about simple things that you do with workflows. Turns out in the case of running, there's a lot of variations on how you run workflows. So we've taken a bit of time to show you this. I promise the next video is going to be simpler. We'll go back to our simple workflow techniques. Specifically, we're going to look at how to delete workflows.